Hey everyone, my name is Patrick. Thank you so much for joining us for the Undignified podcast, where we talk about worship, the church, and everything else. Hey friends, if you don't know me, my name is Patrick. I'm a husband, a dad, a human, a creator, and a worship pastor living in New York City. And I love talking about all of those things. So welcome to the podcast. Today, I'm so excited to have a conversation with a new internet friend named Tim Whitaker. And before we get into today's episode, I just want to have a little chat. You see, on this podcast, Undignified, we talk about worship, the church, and everything else. And if we get into that everything else category, if we get into the church category, if we get into the worship category, and we only ever view things from our own perspective, from what we've been told, from what we've heard, I just don't think that's a healthy way to live. At some point, we need to sit back and think to ourselves, hey, what do I believe about this? What is my opinion about this? Am I just listening to what people say, or am I actually trying to go out and experience things for myself? And that's why I'm so excited to talk to Tim, because Tim is a Jesus lover. Tim is someone who loves the Bible. He's very passionate about the local church, but Tim also finds himself in that fancy world that we throw around in the church. If you're not someone who's a part of the church community somewhere, you probably are going to go, what does that even mean? But Tim is deconstructing. Tim is rethinking his faith. He's rethinking the traditions and then some of the things he's been brought up with and saying, man, I love Jesus, I love the Bible, I love the local church. Man, I'm not sure if I fully align with what I've been told or taught my entire life. And listen, I think sometimes when we enter into conversations like this, as a matter of fact, I can tell you my story. I only have one story and it's mine. I'm sorry, I don't have any other people's stories, but this is my own story. I know that there was a major part of my life where, as a Christian who loved Jesus, I would walk into rooms going, I need to convince everyone to believe the way that I believe. Does anyone align with that? Well, now I live in New York City, and just the 10-minute walk to school with my kids allows me to be near people with different cultures, faiths, backgrounds, ethnicities. It's this pot of diversity. And you'll have little kids walking to school talking about their different experiences in life. And it reminds me of this quote from another internet friend that I've only met in person one time. His name is Whitaker. He says, don't stand on issues, walk with people. There was this large part of my life, like I said, where if I walked into a room where people didn't believe like me, even Christians who said, oh yeah, I love Jesus, but I don't know if I believe this necessarily, and insert hot topic issue here, I would be very uncomfortable. I wanted to be in spaces where I was siloed off from the rest of the world, only with those who completely aligned with my own beliefs. But I think I can sum up my opinions on that now by saying, that's not what Jesus did. If we're going to throw around what would Jesus do? Jesus walked around near people who did not align with him when it comes to beliefs all the time. Now, that doesn't mean that he said, I'm going to, be tossed around, I'm going to just change my perspective all the time. But you know what he did? He was slow to speak and quick to listen, and he asked questions. So today's conversation with Tim was extremely fun for me. It was really challenging for me. There was moments where he shared some things that I said, I've never thought about that. There was moments where he shared some things that I said, oh yeah, I completely agree. And there were other moments where I said, I'm not there yet. I'm not in that place, but thank you so much for sharing, because I didn't need to walk away convincing him of anything. I wanted to hear his story, because again, he only has one story and it's his. So what you're going to hear today is a conversation between two people who do not want to be right. They just want to hear each other share experience. The two people in this conversation, me and Tim, we got to sit on a remote video call and just simply ask and answer questions about our own experiences, our own perspectives, and walk away in a loving manner or I should say, I guess, log off in a loving manner with no judgments tossed around. So as you begin to listen to this episode, there's going to be moments where you go, I don't know if I agree with that. Guess what? That's okay. That's okay. We can be in relationship with people who have different perspectives, and we don't have to convince them of anything else. So I was really excited to have this conversation. I'm really excited to share it with you. Stick with it. Tim's story is an important one, and I'm thankful that he came on the Undignified podcast. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. I am joined by a new friend as of just a couple minutes ago, Tim Whitaker. And I watched you on Carlos Whitaker's podcast, or I listened to you on Carlos Whitaker's podcast. So you're Tim Whitaker with one T?
That's right. The only way to spell Whitaker, for the record.
Yes. That was a great podcast. I loved that interview. I loved the dialogue. I loved where you guys were able to just kind of like get it all out on the table in actually like a really fun way. Did you have fun talking to Carlos?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I connected with Carlos maybe more recently, maybe the past couple months, and we've been going back and forth. I am scheduled to have him on my podcast at some point, and he's like, dude, let's have you on mine as well. And I'm like, dude, anytime you ask a podcaster to talk on someone else's podcast, we always say yes, because we're always the ones asking questions and listening. So if someone's like, why don't you talk and share your thoughts? It's like, I am there right away. So it was great talking to Carlos and, unpacking some of my own story. And I think I hopefully gave some of his audience, some hope that there are ways that are faithful to Jesus that are maybe not where they used to be, so hopefully that helped them.
Let me actually stop you right there, because I loved your conversation, and if that was kind of your goal during that conversation, I was right on track with you. And I kind of want to stop you there because that's exactly what I want to talk to you about today. But I want to share with you kind of like a feeling I had coming into this interview, because I think it really speaks to a lot of what I want to ask you about and talk to you about, if that's okay. So when I was getting ready to, I've followed your stuff for a really long time. And when I was getting ready for like scheduling this interview and just like so excited to have you on, I began to get this feeling, because part of my story is I was raised in Florida in a Southern Baptist church. Don't hold it against me. And obviously very conservative background. And I'm now a worship pastor at a non-denominational church in New York City. And I'm very familiar with the evangelical space. As a matter of fact, we were having like one of our, newcomers, like brunches or whatever.
Totally.
One of the
Pizza with the pastor.
One of the questions that someone just very plainly asked us is, are you evangelical? And it hit me, because I was like, and my pastor did a really great job. I actually love my church. He said, you know what? Technically we are, but there's so much that we do not align with when it comes to that word. And I was so thankful for that. A little bit vague, but kind of on the nose and helpful to that person. But long story short, that's my upbringing. I'm very comfortable in evangelical spaces. And I only have one experience. It's mine, right? I know that my experience isn't everyone's, but growing up Southern Baptist especially, there was not any room for question, debate, doubt. Those things were scary. It was very much a turn or burn, fly or fry culture. If you were not with us, you were essentially against us. But now I'm an adult, right? And I've made decisions about parenting, marriage, where we live, finances, what I believe, all of these things. I'm now able to make decisions on my own. But back to my original point, as I approached this interview, I began to feel fear. And I know I'm not alone in that, because I am sure there's many people like me that ignore you. I'm sure there's many people like me that come into conversations scared of what they're going to hear, what people are going to think. And I kind of wanted to ask you about that, because people like you, and I think sometimes people like me as well, are viewed as big bad, I'm going to say the word, deconstructionists. When that's just not true. You're a guy. You're a guy who has changed his perspective on faith. And I think it's healthy for us to be able to have conversations with people we don't agree with, don't align with. This is something that you have been a phenomenal example of. For instance, you went to America Fest. That's a whole episode in itself. But you have been someone who's not afraid to sit with people who don't align with your values, beliefs, what have you. But I'm someone, and my background makes me approach a conversation like this and just realize for one moment, oh my gosh, I'm a little scared of this. So I can't be the only one, but I'm the only one I've heard talk about it. Is that something that you actually have experienced? Like, people are afraid of these types of conversations? What's been your experience like that?
I gotta be honest, Patrick, I've never, I think, been either told that or asked that question. It's interesting because physically I'm a pretty big dude. I'm like 6'4", 260. And when I have my beard grown out, I guess I look intimidating to people. My hands are tattooed, my arms are tattooed. Yeah. I don't see myself that way physically, but I've been told by several friends, especially like people who are like some of my friends who are female, who are just they're very small. Like my wife is 5'3", and they'll say, when I first met you, I was just so intimidated, and I'm like, really? Like you don't see yourself that way, right? I don't see myself as like an intimidating person, even though I speak pretty bluntly, especially on social media. And I think to some people I can be perceived as, maybe argumentative or combative. And I understand, I think I'm understanding more and more why that's the case. But I'm not sure if I would say I've not experienced directly people being necessarily afraid to talk to me. I tend to be what I call Theo bro passing, meaning I look like a typical, reformed bro. And so because that's kind of my background too, I can speak that language pretty well. So I find that I'm able to communicate my concepts, especially in like conversations like this, in language that maybe isn't so intimidating for people. As opposed to like maybe when they see a reel or a tweet of ours and they're like, oh, sounds really intense, So maybe that's a way of answering it.
No, that's a really great point. I just think that it's less you, and it's more kind of like a conceal, don't feel type of a way to live, where I was raised believing if you bump up against anybody who doesn't think these things or believe these things, be afraid, stay away. And I just don't think, obviously we have values in life, and there are certain things that we want to strive for, align with, what have you. But we live in the world where if you think that everything walks, talks, and acts like you, it's just not the case. Especially you being in Jersey, me being in New York City, we are surrounded by diversity. Diverse thoughts, diverse cultures, diverse beliefs, diverse roles in the home, or whatever the case may be. And I feel like I'm just trying to address that. You have been a pro at creating spaces for people that would probably find themselves closer to where you're at, and people on the very opposite end of that spectrum. And I'm just kind of like saying out loud, that should be the way we do it. These conversations are important, right?
Yeah, I think, definitely regarding like us in TNE as an organization, it depends on what space you're in where we have those conversations. Like, for example, our Facebook community, that's a private group, we tell people emphatically, anyone's welcome to join, but we do prioritize certain voices over others. So if you come in there swinging, saying, hey, I'm a conservative and I'm not affirming, and here's why, we're not going to privilege that perspective over our friends and our folks who are queer. We're going to actually privilege their perspective over yours. Now, if someone can sit and listen who disagrees, they're more welcome to join, right? But then the podcast and like the work that I do as an individual is a little more of like, hey, I'll talk to almost anyone, right? I will go to America Fest and sit down with folks who I vehemently disagree with. But we also have a barrier for them to enter into spaces that for our community, they see as sacred, and they want protection because they need a space where they can vent and just share perspectives and not have this other, like I would argue far right voice trying to say what honestly a lot of us already know. I mean, like you, I grew up homeschooled. Well, I'm not sure if you grew up homeschooled. I grew up being very conservative. I grew up in a John MacArthur type of household, and was always a committed Christian in evangelical spaces. So I'm very, very much aware and familiar with the arguments and the perspectives that Reformed and charismatic conservative evangelicalism has. So we're kind of holding almost like this paradoxical space where it's like, on one hand, yes, I definitely will, and I have had people on the podcast like Samuel Duth, who is a self-admitted Christian nationalist. I've had him on the podcast. I've gotten coffee with him. He gave me a book. I read the book. I'll engage with him, no problem. But is Samuel Duth going to end up in our Facebook community? Heck no, he's not. Because the second he starts saying, how we're all depraved and abortion's murder, it's like, dude, you're in the wrong space. Like you're in someone else's sacred space now, right? Yeah. And so we have a boundary there, if that makes sense.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So, I mean, let's back up a second, because you're already using the acronyms, T&E, baby, the new evangelicals. I'd love to hear, like, in your words, I've already heard it, but for the dozens of people that listen to my podcast, explain just as detailed or as basic as you want, what is it that you do? And then I'd love to hear how you got there. So could you start with, what is the new evangelicals? What should we know about it? What are you guys out to do? How do you function, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually pretty simple. We're a nonprofit organization. Our mission statement is that we hold space for folks who have been marginalized by the evangelical church. We advocate for accountability inside of evangelical spaces, and we help people explore the Christian tradition beyond the evangelical fundamentalism. That's the word that we use, beyond that kind of perspective of Christian thinking. So we're totally committed to Jesus. We're an inclusive community. We're totally queer affirming. And we are committed to following the way of Jesus and to exploring the Christian tradition. That's what we do. And it expresses itself in different ways, whether it's our Instagram content or our podcast episodes or our private Facebook community or our theology classes. We offer everything completely free, and people donate to make the work possible. So that's what we do. How I got here, in a very condensed nutshell version, and again, we can unpack whatever part you want, Patrick, that is applicable to your audience. But essentially, like I said earlier, I grew up a very committed Christian in conservative evangelical spaces. So like I said, John MacArthur, Matt Chandler, Francis Chan. If you're really edgy, maybe some Shane Claiborne. Rob Bell before he defected and became a heretic, right? Like that, those kinds of circles. And again, always committed. I never rebelled. I was serving at church at 8 years old as an usher, handing out bulletins in a suit and tie. Started playing drums at age 11 in the church. Became a very proficient drummer. I still play professionally today. So I am one of those golden children. I did everything right. I waited to have sex until I was married. You name it, I've done it in church world. And essentially 2016 was the moment where something finally got to a breaking point that made me say, I think something is wrong with my own tradition, because the people who raised me on this sexual ethic of purity culture, hey, don't touch yourself or anyone else until you're married, essentially is what they told me. Now they're mad at me because I can't vote for the guy on the cover of Playboy magazine who's bragging about sexually assaulting women. And for the record, I was still pretty conservative. I voted third party. I wasn't a Democrat by any stretch of the imagination. I just knew that, like, Trump didn't embody any of the values that my own faith tradition gave me for 30-something years or 20-something years at the time of my life. And so that kind of set me on this path of like, well, I have to go deeper into my faith. And then COVID happened, and I watched Black Lives Matter exploded, and I'm watching, again, just Christians that I know sharing, I would argue, very anti-Christ perspectives that were cruel and dehumanizing, and essentially said that, hey, I'm not going to say it bluntly, but George Floyd kind of deserved it because he was a criminal. So, I'm not going to say it, but, we can make the connection here. And I'm like, I don't get it, guys. Like, aren't we Christians? Aren't we trying to advocate for life? Don't we follow a guy who was unjustly murdered by the empire? Isn't that the story of Jesus, right? I mean, this is very, for me, very black and white as far as like we should be advocating for someone like George Floyd or Ahmaud Arbery. And then COVID happened. And I remember just watching, luckily my church at the time handled COVID really well. We shut down.
Yeah.
And, I'm not sure if you were in New York City, but if you're on the East Coast, like it's a pretty liberal area. Like there were not many people who were fighting mask mandates. There were a few in my area, but not many. But to see so many, other evangelicals and larger faith leaders like take these stands that masking is tyranny and this is all a pandemic and COVID was definitely planned to shut us down. I'm like, what are we talking about here? I don't understand. And the breaking point that led me to start the New Evangelicals was watching Sean Foyt. You're a worship leader, Patrick. I'm sure you know who he is. Sean Foyt is someone who during when the pandemic hit, and we still didn't know how this thing spread or how deadly it was, Sean Foyt was doing mass worship gatherings unmasked, intentionally defying COVID orders because his big thing was faith over fear and let us worship. And I was still heavily involved as a drummer in my church, all in on the worship stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm like, guys, I don't even know, why is this even a thing? Like, it makes so much sense that if we don't know how this thing spreads, wearing a mask and socially distancing seems like the easiest way to love our neighbor as Christians. So that was when I said, I think we need a new evangelical movement. And that's when I started the New Evangelicals. Then I discovered the term deconstruction. I didn't know that term at all until I started the account and kind of fell into the world. And then a year or two later, here we are as a nonprofit, and this is what I do full time. My church kicked me out, the whole nine. So that's kind of the story.
I'm so sorry that your church kicked you out.
It's fine now. It was very painful then.
I know, but I just want to say, I didn't know that. I think I've heard you say in interviews, like, we amicably parted ways or something like that. And
well, the nut and bolts is that they told me I either have to stop doing the work I'm doing online, or I have to stop being a volunteer drummer with them, which was all I did at the church. I was there for 6 years, all in on the worship side, helping to build the Ableton set list, helping to do everything. So for them to say you can still serve somewhere else or attend but can't serve on worship team was still a death sentence, because what do you do after that? You've been the drummer, or you've been the person on stage for 6 years. How do you field all those questions? You don't. It was essentially a death sentence. So, they put me in a spot that I said, well, I have to leave, obviously, if you're going to give me this ultimatum. So I did.
Well, if I could just rewind, so I am a worship leader, but I think of myself, and I am a worship pastor. And I just want you to hear a worship pastor say, I'm sorry, because I know you're fine now, but that pains me a little bit. I've been in situations like that, some that I've handled terribly and some that I've handled, I think, really well.
Sure.
And I mean, as Carlos often says, and I'm sure you've heard him say this, he says, don't stand on issues, walk with people.
Yeah.
And I really wish, 6 years in doing, all of the program, like, I know that the words, like, many people hear Ableton and they go, what is that? I know that, I do that. To not only be essentially a staff volunteer who's also doing all the programming, I'm sure some MDing and just playing the songs well. And then and again, I don't know the story, it's your story, not mine, but like I wish they would have walked alongside you. And I'm sorry, man. I know it's probably just water under the bridge, but like, I just want you to hear me say that. There are no strings attached to that. I'm just simply saying, I'm sorry. And I think Jesus would have done it differently. And I'm glad you're in a good place now, but I'm sorry.
Well, I appreciate that. I'll share this with you because you get it as a worship leader.
Okay.
This church and I developed this other like separate parachurch ministry. I'm not going to name it because it's well known in my area. And we essentially blew up this idea of a multi-church worship night every other month. And at our peak, we had 60 different churches coming out, 600 people, and everyone on stage was from a different church. So we were all from different churches every other month doing these like very high-end, high production, like on that level, the template for live stream, we were on that level. And so, when I lost, I didn't know that I was jeopardizing that when I left the church, but they essentially told me like, yeah, you're also out of that too. And it's not that I'm not going to say I was the only person who blew it up, but when I came into that, it was on its last leg, and I kind of breathed some new fire into it with the other key people who were running it. And so the four of us really made it like what it was. I mean, we ended up playing Creation Festival at one point. We opened up for one of the bands. It was, for me, being a non-paid person, it was success all the way. And, being told a couple of days later over text message that, hey, me resigning, quote unquote, from my volunteer drummer position is also me resigning from this leadership position at this thing that was really like my baby that I cared the most about. That was the most painful part because I lost all the friendships. Like I lost 90% of those people within a few weeks. And being a type 6 Enneagram, someone who is relationally like very committed and loyal, it was a very painful time, to like just have friendships that I thought would be long-term and thought that, we would be friends beyond maybe some different minor beliefs. Like we're not talking about like, I deny Jesus now. We're talking about like how we view the Bible or how we look at queer inclusion, things like that. To lose friendships and that stuff over that, it was incredibly painful, but it taught me a lot, and it's part of my story now. But yeah, I mean, I figured you as a worship leader would really get that, when you do something that big that you care that much about, to be kind of shoved out because of views that you have around Jesus, to me was totally shocking.
I find that it kind of goes back to what we were originally, or what I was originally sharing of just like, I'm just going to use the word, we are afraid of what you're doing, you're out.
Yeah.
And again, I'm just summarizing based on what I've heard from you, and it's your story, but it's not my experience, it's your experience. But I've seen that happen time and time again. I've been the person. I've made tons of mistakes as a Jesus following Christian that I wish I could take back. And listen, we live, we learn, etc. But there is hurt attached to that. It's my wife's a 6, so I completely understand where you're coming from when you describe like how that felt for you, and to watch not one version of that story could have been, hey man, I'm asking you to take a break because I just want to get to the bottom of like kind of where we're at, and let's find a way back, as opposed to you're out, and also you're out of this via text message. I've been fired from a band via text message before. That's not fun, bro. I've been there. It's not
fun.
Oh my gosh. Well, I just like, as a worship pastor, thank you so much for your years of just like slogging it out in churches. And also as a worship pastor, I'm just so sorry that's your story. But tell me a little bit more, man. I got to be honest with you. I am having a hard time moving on from that just because of what I do.
We can park there as long as you want, man. It's up to you. It's your show,
I
not
know.
mine. You know your audience better than I do.
Well, again, the 12 people are really going to appreciate this moment. It's going to be great. Tell me more about music, because one thing I did want to ask you about, you're wearing, I've seen you wear this shirt in so many videos. Are you a metalhead?
I definitely enjoy my heavy music for sure.
That's something that's so much a part of my story. I remember back in late 90s buying a Metallica single because I just heard it on the radio, all their new stuff. And I'm like, this is really like cool. And like these guitars are really fun. I'm already a musician. And my buddy goes, they've been around since the 80s, right? I'm like, are you serious? And he opens up his CD booklet. Remember those?
Oh yeah, man.
Kill 'Em All, Master of Puppets, and Justice for, and I buy the entire catalog, memorize everything. I'm just in my room shredding, and then my metal journey went extended there. So like watching videos where you have had the Silent Planet shirt on and stuff like that, like you're wearing now, it just brings me so much joy. And also it's just really funny, my experience week in, week out, I'm like on my way to church to lead, modern worship, kind of pop rock-ish music, the stuff you probably played. And but in my headphones, I'm listening to like the latest like Chelsea Grin deathcore album or something, and just like, and people are like, how do you listen to that? I'm like, because it's amazing. What are you talking about? So I find that hilarious. Do you still listen to worship music ever?
Not really these days. I mean, I was so all in. I was in those spaces. And honestly, I think one of the benefits of like church world is that it can make you a very proficient musician because you're playing every week. Yeah. And so I had to thank, my church background for allowing me to still play today professionally in other venues. I got to be honest, dude, like, when I was in it, I was listening to it because you're playing it, and now sometimes I'll throw a song on like just to kind of get nostalgic and think about like the moments I had on the stage with that song. But worship music never excited me, especially being a drummer. I appreciated how specific and how like intentional the parts are for like some of these songs that come out of the worship space, but they never impressed me technically. Like, if I'm going to get impressed, I'm going to put on some Animals as Leaders and listen to Matt Garska, just completely shred. Or I'm going to put on Protest the Hero and just be like, yes, Or for me, also, Dirty Loops. I'm a huge fan of Dirty Loops.
Unreal.
They're just unreal, right? So I was always into, like, the musicians, music, more of that. And then, of course, I grew up an underground, hardcore Christian kid. So Norma Jean, Under Oath, Emery. These were the POD, Supertones. These were the bands that totally shaped me as a human, and that I still listen to today. I mean, I fully admit I'm like my dad, who all he wanted to listen to was Led Zeppelin. I'm like, yeah, this Emery album from 2000 still kicks ass, so I'm gonna play it again.
I'm in line with everything you've said, except I hate the Supertones, and here's why: because their biggest hit is Supertone Strike Back, where they ripped off the opening of Creeping Death from the Ride the Lightning album by Metallica. Am I mad that I didn't think of it first? Yes. Am I mad that they put it on an album and got famous for it and everybody thinks they wrote it? Yes. But that's I will hilarious. Say this. I just interviewed on this wildly successful podcast, I interviewed Chris from Under Oath. He got on
jealous.
And we talked. Oh, it was so... You should reach out to him. Because
I've interviewed Aaron before. I think Chris could be great to talk to.
Amazing guy.
Yeah.
And my, I similar to you, I pestered him on Instagram enough to where he said yes, and we just talked all about the writing process. He played me a little some new stuff that's unreleased, like a snippet here or there, like some sounds he's working on. It was really cool. So I completely align with that as well. I was at the Sapphire Supper Club, which turned into the Social in Orlando, Florida, watching Zayo, Juliana Theory, Ludacris, which became Norma Jean, Living Sacrifice, and that's when my metal roots. Extol, yes, I would fall. There's something wrong with me. I would fall asleep listening to Extol, which I think is technically like black metal, but it's some aggressive stuff. I love
Time
Extol.
Stand Still, bro, or bust. You know what I'm saying? So
I love it. Well, Can I rewind just a few minutes and talk just a little bit more about your journey before you even knew what the word deconstruction was?
Yeah.
Obviously you didn't. You talked about the 2016. You talked about your love for Sean Foyt. You talked about all of these things, and your willingness to process through that. But obviously you just didn't wake up one day saying homosexuality isn't a sin, or I'm not sure what I think about the Bible anymore. What was? Can you talk just a little bit more about that progression? And I know it might be a little bit painful, and I'm not trying to trigger anything, but I'm sure there was a point where early on were you like, I better keep these feelings to myself? Early on, were you outspoken? Were you trying to get the answers you needed? What was that process like for you?
I mean, listen, I think for most people, and I'm one of them, it's a long journey of like, you just kind of follow the yellow brick road, like one step at a time. I found, first off, Facebook reminds me of when I was posting 10 years ago or 13 years ago. And I found like my old blog, I have an older podcast that I had with a couple of buddies who were more conservative, and so was I. But even then, a lot of the positions that I have now, you could easily see like what I was advocating. I mean, dude, 15 years ago, I was writing blog posts saying, hey, we're too cruel to gay people. Yep. Like this is 10 years ago. Okay. I'm 24. I'm 22. I'm like, I get that the Bible is clear at the time, that the Bible is clear that homosexuality is sinful, but why are we elevating this sin over everything else in our culture? I mean, I would literally make Facebook posts saying the Bible talks about greed like 155 times in the Bible. It talks about homosexuality 5 times. I think we have the wrong priority. So like, it's not like this was like a sudden light switch moment where I go, whoa, my views have totally shifted. It's that from the beginning, I thought just how my brain works, like logically. And listen, I'm not saying people who don't see it this way aren't logical. I'm just saying the logic of how my mind operates. It never made a lot of sense, because what I would say to myself is, okay, if the Bible is the most important book and it's God's word to us and everything that's in it is for us to listen and follow, and my pastor's telling me not to trust his words, but to read it for myself, and I'm reading it, and I see these consistent themes of like how we treat the immigrant, the poor, the marginalized, the orphan, the widow, and then I see 6 verses that mention homosexuality, 2 of which are in the Levitical law, I don't think this is the right priority. Like, I don't know. I'm no Bible scholar, but it just seems a little weird that like our churches seem to have no problem tolerating megachurch culture, which is built on greed. That's not a sin, but the gay guy, that's what we have to be fighting against as a church. So this was me years ago, decades ago. And I was always a naturally curious person, and I wanted to take my faith seriously, right? I mean, I tell people that my faith tradition radicalized me. So all I did was, did what they said. They told me don't take their word for it. They told me to follow Jesus no matter where it leads me. They told me take the Bible seriously. So I did. So I started listening to scholars who took the Bible seriously. And when they start telling you like, hey, probably not beamed down from heaven above, and here's why. Oh, here's an example. We have none of the original manuscripts. When you discover that, you go, wait a second. How can this Bible be inerrant if we don't have any of the original manuscripts? How can we validate that there are quote unquote no errors inside the text? And then when you discover that there are competing manuscripts and sometimes the endings of entire books like in Mark are changed, you go, maybe it's a little more complicated. That is taking the Bible seriously, because now we're taking it on its own terms, not this like view of, well, hey, the Bible said it, God said it, that settles it kind of mantra, right? In my opinion, that's not taking the scripture seriously, because we're imparting something that is foreign to what the Bible's actually saying or doing. So anyway, that's a bit of a tangent, but that was kind of my path, was like, I just did what they told me. Okay, guys, I'm all in. I'm radicalized. I'm in. I want to learn more. I want to study more. I want to know truth, quote unquote. So I did. And it turns out what I believe that the faith tradition I inherited was built more on dogma that could not stand up to legitimate scrutiny or questions that people had. And to your point earlier, you mentioned that your tradition didn't really allow for questions. I have found that my tradition allowed for questions, but they already had the answers. So if I didn't land at their answers, I was in trouble, right? So I was taught, sure, yeah, let's talk about hell. But the deck's already stacked. Eternal conscious torment, or you're not a real Christian. So like it was almost even more of an illusion of like, yeah, we're open to questions here, as long as you arrive at these predetermined conclusions. So I think once I started having different conclusions, I think that was when people started seeing me as like problematic.
That's really interesting. And again, I've experienced some of that myself, and I'm sorry you've had to go through that. Now that you're an adult, you've decided to actually, and not to put words in your mouth, you've decided to actually embrace some of that tension and walk into spaces like, I'm saying it right, America Fest, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You walk into spaces where people are, on kind of the other side of that journey or other side of that street. What is it like to try to engage in conversations with people who don't see eye to eye with you, but you're seeking to learn more or maybe even educate? What's it like to have those conversations?
Well, let me think for a second. I mean, so for your audience, I went to what was called America Fest. It's hosted by Turning Point USA. They're a far right like media conglomerate. Charlie Kirk is the main guy behind that. I really went just for research. I went to listen and to learn, almost like a journalist. I wasn't really there to debate people. I'm in their sacred space, right? And so I didn't want to come across as combative because someone from the organization who was attending the event invited me to go. So I said, yeah, I'll definitely go. And then I did like a 25-minute like YouTube video on it when I got back, right? But my thing is, how can we on the topic of far right ideology and what I call Christian nationalism, how can you critique that if you don't know what they're actually saying, right? How can you offer a counterpoint if you're just straw manning the positions that they're making? So the reason why I went to an event like that is because, sure, I can listen to Charlie Kirk or Candace Owens speak on Twitter, but I wanted to understand the culture. Like, what drives people to believe that not only is this the best way forward for America, but it's also the most Christian way forward, right? So there's 11,000 people there. It's a big event. I mean, it's not a small thing at all. So that's why I go to those spaces. Like, I'm really curious to know, okay, how do you see it? Because I remember, and here's why I think I'm making this connection maybe for the first time. I grew up on talk radio. I grew up on Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity. And when I was like 15, 16, you're always told by Rush Limbaugh that, the liberals want to destroy the country and, yada, yada, yada. And you're given this perspective of like good and bad. We're good, they're bad. And as I got older, I remember thinking, okay, I believe that, but I wonder how they see it. Like, I wonder what makes these other people think the way that they do, right? It was a natural inclination for me. I no one told me to think that way. I was just curious. Like, they obviously see it a certain way. How can they see it that way? Because on this side of things, it's so clear, right? And then the more I listened to talk radio, the more I was like, these guys never give Obama or any Democrat any credit for anything. I was like, I don't know, that doesn't make any sense. Like, Obama has to be doing something right to keep the country going. Like, we're all still here, like the world's still moving. He is the husband of one wife. He seems to be a good family man. He can't be all bad. So I think that background is what makes me curious now about people that I truly don't understand, right? Meaning, I don't know how you believe that, the left is quote unquote demonic, that like there are demons on the left. And the answer to that is to dehumanize your opponents and to advocate for a world where they don't exist. I don't know how that's a Christian position, right? I'm like, okay, help me understand, because the words of Jesus say, love your enemy. The fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, and I don't see any of that fruit at these events. Yet you're using God language and you're insisting that you are the most Christian of all Christians. So help me understand that, right? So I think that's kind of my angle in these spaces, where it's like, I'm just curious to understand because I don't see it. So far, and I've talked to a lot of folks in those spaces, including some pretty high profile pastors and stuff, I have not been convinced of their position, but I do feel like I at least understand their position, which is helpful for my work.
I love hearing you describe things like this and various podcast episodes and things like that, because you have this brilliant way of tying it all together. You're talking about reimagining your faith. You're still sharing scripture. You know what I mean? You're talking about, I'm not sure how I feel about the Bible anymore, but this verse is pretty foundational. You know what I mean? Like, it's so interesting how you're able to live in the tension of those spaces. And one of my favorite verses is, always be prepared to give an answer for the hope that you have. Oh, wait, it goes further, but do this with gentleness and respect.
Right.
And that's why I'm so interested in what you do, because it seems like you have a stance and you're strong in that stance, but you're also able to do it with gentleness and respect. And you said earlier that sometimes people think that your content comes across angry or militant. And I'm just like, I see passion. I don't see anger. I don't see a lot of that. Even in this conversation, a lot of these stances, I'm sure many people would, raise up pitchforks and drive you out of the city. But like, it's not angry. It's more Tim wants to have the conversation.
Well, really quick, just two things, regarding the Bible, just so I'm clear to your audience, because I don't think I was earlier. When I say like, I think that we're given this duality of either the Bible is God's inerrant word or you just hate the Bible. And like, my thing is that, no, I still see the Bible as highly authoritative in my life. I still see it as sacred and divine and something that is worth looking at, right? But I believe the Bible is way more complicated than the classic, well, it's the blueprint for life. I don't think that's what a lot of the Bible's trying to do at all, actually. And so, I think for a lot of people, we feel like either we accept the whole Bible as the literal word of God, or we just throw the whole thing in the trash. And I think more people, as they study, are like, actually, it's complicated. Maybe there are some parts in the Bible that maybe we just shouldn't take today, which, by the way, we all do. I'm not aware of anyone who now in America goes, yeah, Paul says for slaves to obey their masters, so guess slavery is pretty good, right? No one says that now. Yeah, right. I know a very few people that would say, hey, Paul says that men shouldn't have long hair. It's an abomination. Very few people would say that, right? So we all do this anyway. So I try to be clear about that, like when it comes to the Bible, I still see it as incredibly important. I just don't see it as this like black and white rule book of like God's absolute objective moral law. I think it's a way more complicated collection of books than that. To your second point, humans are complicated, and I'm one of them. And there are days when I'm very angry. I don't want to mince words. I am angry that in America, it seems like the loudest Christian voices still can't admit that we need some common sense gun legislation as we think about another mass shooting in the country. I'm mad that it seems like loud evangelicals have done so much damage to the queer community. I'm mad that so many pastors are platformed who have a trail of bodies behind them and refuse to take accountability for the hurt and for the trauma that they've caused. So there are definitely things that I am angry about, and I have no problem admitting that. I mean, I think we can look at Jesus, we can look in the scripture. There is room for righteous indignation and anger to happen. But I also know that pragmatically speaking, you get more flies with honey. And I know that I did not change because I was yelled at. I did not go from an unaffirming position to an affirming position by being called a homophobic asshole, right? That wasn't what convinced me. It was my friends who were gay who made room for me. And through their story, I was like, I think I'm missing something here. These are full human beings made in the image of God who are not nearly as quote unquote depraved as I was taught that they were. So I think I'm trying, and we're trying to hold this space of like, we have to be loud and emphatic on what we see are the problems. At the same time, can we have a conversation? Because I want to try and persuade you, because I know that yelling at you is not going to work, right? So it's kind of a both and situation for me.
There is this church program that my church and many other churches do, and it's called Alpha. Have you ever heard of this?
I know Alpha. Yep.
I'm sure you've been invited to it many times.
Yeah, it's like a college thing too, isn't it? Like a college curriculum.
Yeah,
they're all over the place. Yeah.
But long story short, and this is not how I grew up, and this is why it's so earth-shattering to me. It's like it's a meal where you're allowed to say whatever you want. And let me be clear, it is very much from a Christian perspective. The goal is to get people to fall in love with Jesus, to long for the Holy Spirit, all those things. But it starts by being at a table, having a meal with someone, and just simply saying like, what are your thoughts on God? And doing the exact opposite of what I was raised to do, which is when they tell me the answer that, I believe God lives in my cat, then I just go, oh, interesting. As opposed to, flipping through the Bible. Well, you see, it says here, and they say this phrase that kind of reminds me of what you were just describing. They say, don't win the argument, win the person. We want people to feel loved. We want people to feel accepted. And it seems as if, you are angry. Yeah, you are passionate. Yeah, you are fired up about these things. But like you said, you want to win people. You long for things to change, for people to feel safe, for people to feel included. You're not interested in being like, I was right about that. And that's really impressive to me.
I think that's fair. And I think one of the big differences, though, that people maybe in the alpha world might have, right, is that I think my evangelical tradition taught me that like the most important thing is saving souls from hell. Right. I don't think that anymore. Like I'm not convinced that is the overwhelming narrative of Scripture. I'm not convinced that is the point of like what a Christian's role in the world is. I don't. Let me be clear. Do I think hell exists? Yes. I think hell exists on earth. And I also think that the purpose of hell through the biblical narrative has a function, even though I would not hold to eternal conscious torment as being like probably what I believe happens when you die if you're quote unquote not saved. So I think that like, for me, I'm not trying to win people over to believe necessarily what I believe, right? Like, okay, listen, we are participating in a tradition that is 2,000 years old, that has thousands of different expressions, arguing almost over everything besides like Jesus being king and Jesus being the Son of God. I mean, beyond that, you can find people who are arguing over a lot of things. So I'm kind of over like I have the right belief about the Christian tradition and everyone outside of my belief is not a real Christian. I'm kind of over that because it's a fool's errand. I'm much more concerned about what's the impact we're leaving on this earth as little Christs, right? Like, I think at the end of the day, do I believe that like the world will be reconciled through Jesus? Yes, I believe that, but it's probably not going to happen in my lifetime. So because of that, I have an obligation to do everything I can now to liberate the oppressed, right? To fight for the poor, the orphan, the marginalized, and to fight for justice. So I very much see, our commands as Christians, not so much this like separate, almost dualist view of like, we'll save the soul, forget the body. I believe this is a both and scenario of like, humans as people, especially through the Christian narrative, I believe souls and bodies are together. They're not separate things. So we have an obligation to care for the human beings on this planet right now and to do everything we can as both individuals and as a society to advocate for laws and for a culture that really looks after especially the most marginalized, right? And a culture that would ask the most greedy and the most oppressive to repent and to go the other way and to participate in a better way of living that isn't built on more, but on generosity, because there's plenty to go around. So that's what I want to be clear for your audience, because we can use the same language, but I think I have a very different focus than maybe the typical evangelical understanding of, hey, pray the prayer, walk down the aisle, get saved, so don't burn in hell forever, and then maybe you can get discipled at our church. That's fine, but I think that there are more important issues to handle than that personally at this point.
Tim, that's like, if someone would take the time to actually sit down with you, I'm sure if you and I spent a week together, there's plenty of things we would disagree on, but sitting down and hearing your desire to love the person now and consider the marginalized and welcome them in, that is what Jesus did. And I also have to say that I appreciate the fact that you keep saying my audience. The fact that you even believe I have one is just incredible to me. I'm so
I'm
thankful
sure you have an audience.
I actually, the whole, to take a total left turn, left turn, we both lean left. That's great.
Nice.
Nice. Thanks. To take a bit of a left turn, I do the content creation game thing in my own time, and it's something I am passionate about. And, forget all the we believe this, we believe that, but the way you and your team or your company or just the nonprofit, the way you have shared what you're doing through social media and through content creation has been really, really cool. And I just want to ask, do you do all of that on your own?
Yeah, that's mostly me. I have we have one volunteer who helps out with branding, and if we do like a carousel post, she'll help me kind of design it. And then I have someone who I'll bounce reels off of to get feedback, and he's pretty good with knowing what's going to hit and what's not. So I definitely have people who help refine some of my ideas. But as far as the content itself, it's usually me, and that, I should be clear, that's mostly by necessity. So we had a couple volunteers who were the face of content for us. And for a lot of reasons, they had to step back, family issues, things like that. So I love not being the only face of TNE doing this content, but first, because I'm the only person on a paid staff position, and I know how much work content takes to actually make and to actually make it successful, I'm very hesitant with asking people to volunteer hours to make content unless they really want to be all in and they're cool with it, right? Because I've been a volunteer and I know the tension of volunteer burnout. So we have 17 volunteers who work with us, and we really try and manage that as much on their time as possible. And sometimes I'm always over the top where I'm like, are you sure? And they're like, listen, dude, I know, volunteer burnout. I know, I want to help. Let me help. So sometimes I'm almost too conservative on that end, But yeah, the content is pretty much me.
Did you just call yourself a conservative? Just kidding. Moving on.
Get that out. Edit that. I didn't mean that. Sometimes I'm way too Marxist and socialist. There you go. Oh, much better. Much better.
I still exist in the world. I mean, you were talking earlier that there are literally thousands of expressions of the way to follow Jesus. There are literally so many expressions that I'm in the one that calls themselves a non-expression. I am the non-denominational. There's literally so many.
Right.
And we have to be able to laugh at that a bit. If we can't laugh at ourselves, what are we doing here? But I am in having done ministry since I was 13 years old in like a high-level volunteer or staff position. Not that one is more important than the other. There's just more accountability, more stuff that comes along with it. I am also someone who finds myself being overly protective of volunteers. Are you sure? I love putting bands together. I love putting cool video projects.
You said yes in PCO for the fourth time in a row, Bobby. Yeah. Are you sure you're okay?
Good old Bobby. Yeah, and like I'm the guy that's like, it never hurts to ask, but please tell me, are you sure? Are you sure? Right. And I feel like that's really cool that you're now in a different nonprofit, but you have this somewhat traumatic experience to live off of, to say, or to reference, to say, yeah, this can be beautiful, but let's protect, like you said, let's protect the human body.
To be very clear with your audience, again, I like saying audience. It's so much fun here. Hello
dozens,
audience.
Hello audience.
To the dozens.
Hello friends.
Yeah. Yeah, dude, really quick. When my first podcast was just me and three buddies, and I totally know that feeling of like, hi mom, hi buddy down the street, and hello 5 other people who maybe randomly found me. So it's good to be with all of you.
Someone on Sunday, one of our vocalists came up. I have 2 podcasts. One's called Create, Post, Repeat. It's all about content creation, CPR. Cool. And the other one is
that's good.
Sorry. And the other one is called Undignified Worship, which I think that's where this one will live, because it is a little bit, to use a terrible phrase, it's faith specific.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one of our amazing vocalists, shout out Marissa, she walked up to me and she goes, I love your podcast. And I was just like, you listen to my podcast? I couldn't believe it. And I should have been like, of course she listens. I work hard on this. This is good content. But I was like, and then my next question was, which one did you listen to?
Right.
Because I was so worried.
Bro, can I just tell you, solidarity, I so know that feeling. Like, first off, it's like a shock moment. Like, wait, you're listening to my voice when I'm not in the same room as you. That's weird. Also, sorry if I came across too, I guess, liberal or something. I'm so sorry. Like, everything's cool. I love Jesus still, I had one person who I knew or know say, this is a while ago, she was like, yeah, I'll fall asleep to your podcast sometimes. I'm like, thanks. I don't know how to take that. But thanks.
So bad.
I know. But it is a privilege, right? Like, the fact that people would listen, it's a huge, like, to have anyone listen, dude, podcasting is so saturated, right? To have anyone listen to you is a huge privilege. So even if it's a dozen people, which I'm sure it's more than that, it's still amazing that people would sit down and listen to you, have a guest on to share different perspectives. And that can be part of that small change that we so desperately need in church circles. So I think good on you, man. Good on you.
Thank you so much. Well, I know we're running close to time here, and I wanted to ask you one more thing. And I find it to be, for me, this is valuable. I want you to imagine, if you will, like, there's no part of me that thinks you believe you know everything, have all the answers. Like you said, you go places for research, for learning. You're trying to grow. You're trying to share a message, but you're also trying to learn more about that message. I love the process you're going through. But I think, to kind of go back to what I was originally saying, we, and I mean me, the church, there are some great churches out there, some great religious organizations that do really well with conversations like this. And then I would say, in my experience, the majority of conversations like this that I've experienced, watched, witnessed, whatever, just haven't been great. Like, I have had I've been in plenty of scenarios where I don't listen well. I'm quick to speak, slow to listen, as opposed to be slow to speak, quick to listen. And you being someone who exists in spaces where you are longing for marginalized to feel welcome, longing to kind of be willing to live in some of the doubt, some of the processing. What's something, given your experience, and I know it's only your experience, but if you could sit every pastor in your area, or every pastor in the tri-state area, or every church leader in an, like if you could sit everybody down and just be like, guys, this is something I'd appreciate it if you did. Or, hey, folks, it would help the world if the church learned this. Again, your opinion, what would you want someone like me to learn? What would you want someone like me, a local church pastor, to walk away with if I promised that I would sit there and just not speak for 15 minutes and hear what you had to say based on your experience?
I mean, I think there are like three things that are high level for me. I think the first one would be realizing that there's a reason why people are leaving the spaces that you occupy. And instead of blaming them for leaving, maybe do some of that repentance or self-reflection and take a hard look at your systems and the culture you're a part of and ask yourself why that is. I think that's the first thing I would say. Too often I see, a response by faith leaders who are like, people who are deconstructing or who are leaving the church, they just want to sin more. They don't love God anymore. It's like, you're totally misrepresenting why the majority of us have left the church, the evangelical church, but are still clinging to Jesus. I mean, to put it, in a nice slogan, we're having a crisis of theology, not a crisis of faith. Big difference. So I think that'd be the first one. Like, just please start listening and self-reflecting on the systems that you're a part of, and ask yourself, why is Mark Driscoll still platformed in your spaces? Like, why? Why is that person still doing the conference speaker circuit, but people like your volunteers are getting kicked out because we landed differently on a topic like queer affirmation or not? Help me understand that. The second thing I would say is that, and this might be a hard reality for people to swallow, but I am a very blunt, I'm from New Jersey, so we just say things directly. I truly believe it's only a matter of time before evangelicalism becomes largely queer affirming. And you can look back through history. It was only a couple of decades ago when most evangelicals were staunch segregationists, thinking that, hey, the racists need to stay separate. Here's our Bible verses. We're standing on the word of God. I mean, you can literally read a Bob Jones sermon. I have it archived for this purpose. You can read a Bob Jones sermon from the 50s. All you have to do is insert queer, and you have the same exact arguments, the same slogans. People who don't see it this way are liberals and are standing on the word of God. The Bible is clear. Here's the scripture verses. So I really am convinced that, once again, the evangelical church is on the wrong side of this issue. And in 10, 20, 30 years from now, we're going to look back and say the same thing we say now about people like Bob Jones. What were they thinking? They were so wrong. They so missed it. And now we're trying to pick up the pieces. So that's the second thing I'll say. The last thing I'll say is that when I tell pastors who ask me this question, I say, listen, let me give you a hard reality. You're not discipling your congregation. Tucker Carlson is. Matt Walsh is. Candace Owens is. Far-right media has the ear statistically of white evangelicalism more than any other group. 61% of white evangelicals watched Fox News in the past 24 hours when Tucker was still on the air. Think about that for a minute. And that's an hour every night. That's 2 hours a day. So I would really implore pastors to start listening to some of those people. You should turn on Tucker Carlson. You should turn on Charlie Kirk's podcast and Candace Owens' podcast, and you should listen to what people in your audience are listening to. Because I'll tell you what, it's incredibly dehumanizing. A lot of it is built on half-truths, okay? And it's incredibly cruel. And so I want pastors to wake up and realize that, like, whether they realize it or not, a storm is coming and it's already starting to rain. And until they realize what's happening in their churches regarding far-right media and their intentional targeting of white evangelicalism, they're going to be caught with their pants down, frankly. So it's time to wake up and smell the roses, because we have a major problem on our hands in these circles.
I really appreciate that honesty. And I mean, that's challenging for me as well. And, purposely throughout this conversation, I don't want to give any disclaimers, or I don't want to say the things like, now before you say this, who knows what everybody out there believes. I think you live in you exist in a very specific space where you have a very unique perspective, and to be able to hear some thoughts from you that honestly 80% of what you just said I probably wouldn't have put together. And that's helpful to me.
Can I just really quickly just mention one little thing about that? When I tell you, or when I tell people, hey, like, here's why I'm concerned about evangelicalism, two things. Number one, I love the church dearly. That's why I'm so concerned, right? If I didn't love the church, I would not do this work. This work is not fun. It costs me my entire community, right? I run a nonprofit with 2 kids and a wife in New Jersey, just trying to survive. I could do other things that make me a lot more money. So if I didn't care about the church, I wouldn't do this work. This all comes out of a heart for, are we willing to acknowledge that we have a problem? Problems when we acknowledge problems, we can make things better. That's kind of how I think about it. The second thing I'll say is that I'm not just giving experiential, perspective. This is data. You can look up studies done by Pew Research. You can look up studies done by PRRI on Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism in particular is roughly adhered to by 30% of the population in the US. So it's not a minority position. However, 3/4 of white evangelicals hold Christian nationalist positions. Okay, that's not me giving you nonsense. That's data. That's research. You can look up sociologists like Samuel Perry. So the reason why I'm so emphatic on this stuff is not because I have a few friends who like Matt Walsh, but because I've read the data. I interview on our own podcast the scholars who for a living track this stuff sociologically, theologically, reach-wise. So I'm not just saying random boogeyman things. I have actual data to back up this position, which is why I think pastors, whether they see it or not, need to wake up and understand that statistically in their congregation, especially if they're a white audience or predominantly white church, 3/4 of their congregation is thinking that Tucker Carlson probably has good things to say. We have to realize that before we can go any further.
Yeah, I was listening to a content creator recently who I really respect, and he's pretty vocal about being a Christian, and I am hoping that he recorded this months ago and they just got it edited. But he just said, Andrew Tate, controversial guy, but I agree with some of the stuff he says, and when he's creating content, and I'm just like,
there you go,
and I'm just
there you go.
And like I said, in my opinion, you keep throwing out pretty dynamite statements, and then I respond, and you follow it up with this dynamite statement that just kind of glues it all together. You're a great communicator, man. And I don't mean like you're a great showman. I mean like you're actually good, which is, I had a family. That's what when I was a young kid and I was being told for my first vote ever how to vote, a relative looked at me and he said, Obama, he's just a showman.
Right.
Got it. Thanks.
Right.
And I don't mean it like
Noted.
that. I mean, you're a good communicator. And what I mean by that is, here's my perspective, Patrick. Patrick responds and you'll say, and just to follow that up, I love the church. Let's be clear.
Right.
I love the church and I want to see it thrive in the best way possible. These aren't just like, I did my own research. This is actual other professional people's research that I'm studying and looking at and coming to a conclusion based off of. So I just respect that. I'm thankful for that. And this has been one of my favorite conversations I've ever had because it's been so incredibly interesting. And I'm thankful for your perspective, and I'm thankful you're willing to still talk with pastors. Because if you're sitting here going, man, I still love the church. I mean, obviously you want to have conversations with pastors and share your perspective. And I think that you do such a good job of that. But before we go, where do you want people to find you? Where can people follow you? Where can people keep up with what you're doing? And if someone's super interested, like, what would you say, like, next steps for them should be?
I mean, anywhere that the New Evangelicals is pretty much where we are. We're probably most engaged on Instagram between stories and posts. We have a podcast and stuff, so you can always DM us. I get back to pretty much every DM via Instagram.
Yeah.
I mean that's the easiest way. And for people who want to know more, what I would say is if you think your only options are conservative evangelicalism steeped in far right politics or atheism, I would just say there are dozens of other ways forward as faithful Jesus people that is not either one of those extremes, right?
Yeah.
So there's definitely better ways forward, and you don't have to swallow this idea of like, well, only good Christians vote this way or have this perspective. There are other ways to think about these things that are still fully faithful to Jesus and take their faith extremely seriously.
Wow. And that's so, the most eye-opening thing there is when you say, the options are not this or atheism.
Right.
And I go, of course not. But there was a portion of my life where I believed that. And I think that's, I think that's so helpful. Well, it has been a treat talking to you. I'd love to do it again sometime because I'm super challenged by a lot of the things that you say, and I'm super thankful for the way you present it. And man, I would just love to keep talking because this has been a really fun conversation.
Listen, man, I'll come back on and talk anytime. We should do some deep dives on worship culture next time. That'd be a lot of fun. I got a lot of thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, you should have a lot of thoughts on it. It's
production. We can nerd out on production too.
We can nerd out on production too. So we can have our Ableton podcast. Yes. We can have our production podcast. We can have worship songs. What was, if you can remember, was there a worship song you enjoyed playing as a drummer?
Glorious by B.J. Putnam.
Okay.
Do you know that song?
I know B.J. Putnam. I know, and the only Glorious I know is by Tomlin. And I'm assuming you covered it from...
I'll shoot you a link. I did a drum cover of it. You can watch it. It's a great song. It's fun to play, but it ends playing in 7. It goes to bars of 7.
Oh.
And the drummer on that album, this is a real deep cut for drummers out there. His name is Chris Coleman. Chris Coleman is a drum god, okay? This guy is like... He's one of these like drummer. You'd watch him and you go, why do I even bother playing? He's like a Matt Garska, but he's a totally different kind of player, okay? And so he drummed on that song, and there's no actual tutorial of what he does at the end. It's I've listened to it so many times, so I pretty much had to create my own part to try and replicate it, which it came out great. I'm thrilled, but it was nothing like what he did. So I would say that's one of my favorite songs to play, and I'll still watch that video some time ago. This one took me the longest to learn, in several hours of figuring out, especially the ending, but it paid off the most for sure.
Dude, that's awesome. I know the name B.J. Putnam, but I don't know that song specifically. But I bet if you send it to me, I will be like, or if I find it, I'll just be like, oh, I know this song because
I'll email it to you. Because the ending, I'm proud of the ending. I tell people that. I'm like, I'm proud that I figured this out and created this.
Yeah, you did. That's awesome, man. Well, hey, thank you so much for the conversation. I so look forward to talking about Ableton and all the other things and worship culture a whole nother time.
Thanks, Patrick.
Have a good one.
Thank you so much for joining us. Links to everything you need can be found in the description. And as always, if you need to get a hold of us, you can shoot us an email at theundignifiedworship@gmail.com or follow us on Instagram @thisisundignifiedworship. We'll see you next time.